This is the Quo-Cast. My name is Jamie Dyer, and I am here today joined by producer John Eden, and you'll definitely know the name because he's worked with Quo on several occasions, one of which we're going to discuss in this particular podcast. You might remember some years ago he did the remix for Rockin' All Over the World, which was featured as part of a deluxe edition. And what a change it was. We're going to hear more about that now. But first, John, how did you come to work on Rockin' All Over the World, the album, in the first place?
Well, Jamie, first of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to you for inviting me to your podcast, and a big hello to all the Quo fans that are listening out there right now. And I'm looking forward to having a great session here with you from the northern shores of California. I think there's a strong link here back to Graham Bonnet. I'd worked with Graham Bonnet in probably around 73 time. He was signed to DJM Records, and I'd worked with him on some of his early recordings that he did with a producer called Kaplan K. And I was for a few years, I was heading up the studios there for Dick James in New Oxford Street. And then I went back and I rejoined the Marquee. And I was doing a session actually with a DJ from Radio Luxembourg called Mark Wesley. And Mark used to write and produce in his spare time when he wasn't on air, broadcasting on 208. And he would come over to London and he would record, these songs he'd been working on. And on one of these sessions, he picked me to be his engineer, and Pip Williams was playing guitar. He'd hired Pip. Pip was a highly sought after session guitarist at that time, and arranger. And that was actually the meeting that I had with Pip. And we got on really well in those sessions that Mark was producing. And Pip started to talk to me about some of the upcoming productions that he was going to start working on. And one of them was a guy called Chris Andrews. And so our relationship really started at that period. And then one day he said, I've had a call from David Oddy at Quarry Management, asking if I would be interested in producing Graham Bonnet. And I said, well, absolutely fantastic. I said, Graham is just an amazing singer. And after I'd worked with him at DJM, the album never got released. Graham did a film with his wife, Adrian Poster, and that wasn't terribly successful. And I kind of wondered what had happened to Graham. But he teamed up with David Oddy, who was one of the management team of Quarry, at Quarry Productions, and Pip was being asked to do the Graham Bonnet album. So we started to work with Graham, Pip and myself, and we did a couple of albums together. And then because within the Quarry Productions team, they also managed Quo, then that was really how the opportunity came up to work with Quo. But it actually started really in a line from Graham Bonnet, and Pip had known, my understanding is Pip had known David Oddy and worked with him musically on some other previous projects as well. So that was the start of it.
That is some story. Do you know if that Graham Bonnet album ever did eventually get a release?
I believe that Graham put it out a few years back. I had Graham come over to my studio in Nashville to record some vocals up with an artist that I was working with called Carla Davis, and he'd brought a cassette with him at the time that Kaplan K was the only really record of those sessions that had been kept, and there was this cassette that Cap had sent to Graham, and Graham brought the cassette to me, and I made a transfer for him. I understand that later on Graham decided to put this material out himself. but I, apart from listening to the tracks in the studio with him, I didn't have any involvement in that release.
But you did have involvement in the release that we're going to be talking about, which is the Rocking All Over the World remix. Now, when you were originally recording this, the album marked something of a change in Quo's career. How do you think the actual recording process differed to their previous albums? Because it does sound quite different.
Well, I mean, my understanding of when they worked at IBC was that they were basically all in the room together. There was very little separation. I mean, I had stories of sometimes of them taking in their PA to try and create as much of a live environment in the studio as they could. So it was very much, everything was very open and probably a lot of spill going on. And that was how those records were made, Whereas when we started out together, it was the studio environment, the recording environment and rooms had changed really because of an American guy called Tom Hidley, who started a company called Westlake Audio, actually in California. He did the Westlake Audio studios in Hollywood, and then he actually did a room for the Moody Blues at Decca, and Decca was actually the first Westlake room that was built as a control room under Tom Hidley's design. And then the second room was the Manor Studios, which he did for Richard Branson. And in fact, I was one of the first people to go in there and record at the Manor, and as that Westlake room, started to take in sessions, and the design was a much deader concept. It was deader in the control room environment, and it was a lot deader and isolated in the actual recording rooms. And the idea was that to actually get better separation between the instruments. And I mean, in hindsight, as time has gone on, there's been changes back the other way. And I mean, I've made changes back when I did the Just Supposing and the Never Too Late albums at Windmill Lane, because got everybody pretty much back around and in a circle. And I thought that was probably the better approach for Quo, But yeah, I mean, when we set off and we recorded at Studio Bohus, for instance, John was in a room on the left side, which was like marble floors, a lot of glass on the walls. There was a patio door there that linked into the main section of the room, and then there was a lot of areas of separation, screened areas, where we were able to set up the guitar amps. So the isolation when I went back to look at the tracks was pretty good on looking back on it that I did those years ago when I did the remix.
Well, judging by the YouTube videos, you did do some kind of gate mastering, didn't you, on some of those tracks, because there's just a little bit of spill there, but obviously, as you say, not as much as earlier material.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I actually used a room that I had in my own studio there that was a whole concrete room, and sent John's drums out to, and I remiked it, and to get the ambience of that room, to bring a little bit of extra life into his kit, and I think that helped. I mean, I didn't use it on every single track, but on the songs that I felt it was more appropriate to, I did,
Yes, and you can certainly hear the difference with that. How did this remix first come about?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a bit of a long history to that whole process. I mean, at the time the album was released, we were using a different technique of mixing to what we did in later years. Number one, we did have long playing sides, which affected how much bottom end we could get across onto disc. I I don't know. I think it was just we were mixing more for. You have to remember that back then we didn't have any FM stereo. Everything, I mean, Radio One was in mono, and so a lot of the mixing we were focusing on really getting it to translate well onto a 3-inch speaker. And so we mixed the album, and our main reference point was for balancing became a small little Auratone cube. But you have to understand, when you start to look back on it, you can see that if we'd kind of probably used a more mid or near field monitoring system, it would have probably been even different at that time. But we were focusing a lot on Radio One. I mean, despite what's said about it, it being for American market, we were still trying to make a record that was going to appeal to the fan base in the UK. And it sounded. I mean, when you listen to the original mix of Rockin' All Over the World over mono radio and it's compressed, it sounds great. And I think that it just later on it became obvious that we could have it could have sounded better. But you have to remember the sales of that album were phenomenal. I mean, the signs that we were getting were that we were heading down the right road for the mass of the buying public that were buying these records. I mean, it was hugely successful, So the question of remixing it became, in my mind, a necessity later on, many years on. I thought, well, out of looking at certainly of the 5 albums I did, it was the one that I was probably the least proud of. And then we had a better communication. We started to have a social media, the message boards, and you could start to see the fan reaction. And I'd spoken and it was like, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized at one point. I mean, when I joined the message board, I think much after Pip had initially been there, and then he'd left because he'd gone through such a lot of abuse there. And I talked to him, and I actually got him to come back on. And it was. I think it's pretty unfair in many respects. You have to remember that. I mean, from where I sat working with Pip was an amazing musician. Number one, a great guitar player. A phenomenal string arranger, and I'd sit next to Pip, and I'd watch him write a whole orchestral chart in his head. I mean, he's a musical genius, and we had many good years of working together on albums and other projects. I mean, we'd also worked with Mud, for instance, before we got to doing the Rockin' All Over the World album. We did Lean on Me together. We did a solo single with Brian Connolly from Sweet, and we did an incredible project with 3 guys that were called Bardot that were signed to RCA Records, and that was just an amazing musical and sonically sounding album with some fantastic string arrangements that Pip had done on. So I think a lot of what was leveled against Pip was pretty unfair, and I also feel that, I was there in the chair with him. I mean, we were doing this together. So, I mean, as he is the producer of that album, I mean, he carried the can, but equally, I think I have responsibility in that situation as well. So I did feel I did feel that there was a certain onus on me to try and make it happen, in terms of getting a better version, and it really was the most prominent out of everything that I've done, or even looking at their catalog, that I could say, hey, this one really did warrant going back. And I decided that I was going to build a studio in Nashville, and I had actually, I think, sent Pip, or I had a caller, or sent him a note, and I said, look, I'm going to build this studio, and if you're interested in coming over, I'd front the time to do it, that we could remix it, but I never heard anything from him. I never had a response at that period from him to that offer. So I think about a year later, I was having a chat with Francis, and Francis has said, "Hey, I've moved houses. I've got this new studio I've built. Do you fancy just coming over socially, just to hang out and spend some time together?" It'd been a long time since we'd seen each other, and so I said, "Yeah." I said, "Sure." I said, well, "Let's plan on some dates out." So I flew out to Gatwick from Nashville, and he came to pick me at the airport. I remember he came with his son, and I'm looking around for him, and suddenly I hear somebody whistling "Rockin' All Over the World," and there he was. So he picked me up, and I went and stayed with him, and we had a great time doing just normal stuff. It wasn't anything about working together. It was just a social, two old mates, getting together and having a bit of fun. I mean, we went to the gym together. We went and cut grass at his old house together. I mean, we didn't do anything in the studio. I mean, he showed me the studio, and I saw huge amounts of some of the 2-inch tapes from the albums. I knew he had a lot of tapes, for instance, there of the stuff that we'd done in Holland, of the 2 albums that we'd done in Holland, Heat and Whatever You Want. And at that point, I said to him, I said, "Francis," I said, I really think we should remix the Rockin' All Over the World album." And he said, "Well," he said, I don't really think it's like a Hotel California that warrants that kind of treatment of going back over it." Again, he said maybe I could see. He said I could see maybe 3 songs, maybe 4 songs, but not the whole album. And I said, "Well," I think if it's going to be done, then I said I think I really would like to do the whole album. So in order to try and put me off, he said, "Well, if you'll finance it and you can get Simon, the manager, to okay it," he said, "you could go ahead and do it." He said, "I have the tapes somewhere. I'll try and find them." And but he said, "There's no money in it." He said, if you want to front it, then you can." And so I think I surprised him, and I said, "Okay, then I will do. I'll do it." Because I felt so passionate about doing this, really for the fans. Number one, Bob got the tapes out, and then I sent him my FedEx account, and he boxed them up and he shipped them to me. And then there's a process where you've seen, I think, probably in the unpacking of the tapes when they finally arrive. And then the next thing that I had to do was to come up with this method of actually baking the tapes, because although baking you visualize putting them in a regular oven, that was that was the last thing that you would want to do. But they had to be heated just to the right temperature, which funnily enough fell within the range of a food dehydrator. So I got a hold of one of these circular kind of machines, and it had stacked layers inside it, and I cut out the inner core just wide enough to fit in a 10.5-inch reel of tape. And then I came up with another digital thermometer to put in there that had an alarm that would act as a safeguard, that if the thermostat on the machine actually went open circuit, it wouldn't damage the tapes, and I would get an alarm that it exceeded the temperature setting I'd set to the probe that went in the bottom. So that process was like, a day of baking, 8 hours, then letting them cool overnight, and then putting them on the machine the following day. And I got to the 4th reel, having done the first 3 in terms of, having baked them. And then I got to the 4th reel, and I thought, well, I'm just going to try with this last reel, putting it on the machine. And I didn't lace the tapes, are stored end out because of the print through issue that happens. That's something I've talked about in one of the videos on YouTube. And I basically was able to rewind the tape without wrapping it through any guides that would take any oxide off. and I got it to the front of the head of the machine, and I put the machine into play, and the machine just would not move. It was just completely locked up. Such was the way that this sticky oxide was just preventing the tape being pulled off the supply reel, and it was quite an interesting thing to actually witness. So I baked that, and then it played first time the following day. Now there are a few tracks that suffered wire and flutter in the long-term storage. I had to do a few little bits of surgery, here and there, to try and make that less obvious. To a very trained ear, you can notice it on one or two of the tunes. But as a whole, I felt it was recoverable and good enough to actually go through the process of remixing every song and putting it out as an album. So that was the process,
I'm sure every Quo fan is very thankful that you went through all of that. I mean, there's so much there to digest, and it's really, really interesting. But obviously, once you got over that process and you're there and you're at the mixing desk, so to speak, how long did it take to remix each track?
Well, I had the luxury, first of all, of my own studio. I wasn't under any. I mean, Universal didn't even know this was going on. There was just myself, Francis. I'd actually not even spoken to Richard. I think Bob had spoken to Richard, but I hadn't had a conversation with Richard. And I'd spoken to Alan, and I'd spoken to John, and John knew I was doing it. John knew at the beginning I was going to do it, and so he was very excited about that. But there was really nobody that knew this was being done, certainly from the label point of view. So there was no deadline, there was no pressure to say, hey, it's got to be done. I had the studio, I suppose the whole thing, from getting the tapes, going through all the baking process, having a couple of weeks break in the middle of summer, I was on it for about 4 months. And some tracks, can't give you more. I think I was on that for about 6 days. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of time to spend on one song, and you go, how do you justify it? But when you get into this and when you're passionate about it, and I was like, I knew there was a lot resting on this. I mean, it could have gone awfully wrong, and it could have backfired. So I didn't want to be sticking my neck out, not only financially in terms of taking this on, but also for the fans. I mean, I didn't want to disappoint the fans in any way. So I wanted to put whatever amount of time into it was until I felt I'd done the best I could with what I was able to recover through the transfer process. So I didn't, there was no budget. I wasn't working to a budget. The only budget was my own, in a way. If it had been done another way, it would have had to have been done a lot faster and decisions made a lot quicker, because if a record company had been paid for it, they wouldn't have given me this open-ended thing. I wouldn't have been able to do the videos, for instance. I mean, I went out and bought the camera and a bunch of other gear and headset microphones and stuff that I wouldn't normally use, but I needed that gear to be able to make these video clips that you're now getting to witness. And there was two thinkings, I think, initially behind that. One was I had a discussion with Francis, and it was known at that point that the documentary was being done, and so there was a possibility of some being used in the footage. And in my mind, how I would really have loved to have seen this issued out to the fans was not packaged in the way it was done, with demos being added and you having to buy the original album again, that you had already got all those years ago. It would have, but you have to understand there was certain business contractual things of why it happened that way, that I didn't have any control over. But in my ideal, what I wanted to deliver the fans was a completely self-contained new version with a DVD of the process. And on the DVD, I wanted there to be, high definition audio of those mixes as well. So you were getting not only seeing the actual process that you're now seeing on YouTube, but also getting a bunch of the 24-bit 96K files that I'd made of the very high resolution audio of the mix. And that was what was in my mind. And of course that didn't happen, sadly. And of course the album was, I didn't see, I mean, I was trying to follow from being in America, but I really didn't see there being any promotion to it, I just saw an overwhelming reaction, fantastic reaction from the fan base. I mean, more than what I could have ever imagined. I mean, at that point I was on Facebook, and I had a lot of really, great feedback from the fans. And so that was very, very satisfying. I mean, it's very satisfying to do something like this and to see the reaction coming back from the fans, not only from when you got to hear the CD, but now even in the recent weeks since I've started to release the YouTube videos. And very, very grateful for all the positive input that I'm seeing. But you have to remember, I was the engineer on this. I was the recording engineer, and Pip was the producer. So what you're seeing in isolation of these ideas and these unusual things are all ideas that were Pip's ideas. They were not mine. I can't take credit for that, because it was his concept. And so again, I hope that I hope the fans will also see a balance here between, really what a great job Pip did as the original producer of this album. I mean, sure, as a producer myself, I've made decisions beyond what an engineer would make in terms of the remix, but I felt that I could do that because, hey, at that point, I'm the one that's fronting it. Nobody was actually paying me for the time I went in to do this. It was on my end. So I felt, well, I'm doing this, so I'm going to do it the way that I really want it to be done. And in actual fact, at the end of the day, Francis had said, he wanted me to just do this alone, this remix, because he wanted my view on it, and that's how it happened. And I was also I had this idea of a new running order. I wanted to change things for the fans. I wanted it to be a different product. I didn't want it to be just a replication of what you'd had before, and then that's why I extended the songs out, left some funny stuff in at the beginning occasionally, and I just wanted it to be different. I felt I'm not one that likes the idea that fans are always buying something that's repackaged in some way just to improve the profitability of a label's record company's bottom line. I think that the fans deserve to have something that's delivered in a different way when they're being asked to buy a record again of the same songs. So anyway, that's just me.
You can definitely tell that there is care and attention paid to this, and like I said before, the fans are very grateful for the extended bits. I mean, there are things on the original album where it fades out, and as a fan of that band, you do wonder what happens. What happened to finish it? How did it end? And with tracks like Rock Us Rollin' and Hold You Back, and that question is now answered. But obviously, you spend a lot of time on this. You said 6 days on Can't Give You More Alone, one of my favourite songs of all time. I wondered, obviously, you would have encountered so many issues with the remix. Can you remember any in particular? Were there any issues with the remix?
There were a couple in the tape transfers. There was some wow and flutter issues that really became very obvious on things like the intro bottleneck on Who Am I? And I did have to take out the first 2 bars of that. And you'll notice on the remix, I make the entry of the bottleneck a little later. And, I did have some fans that picked up on that and were a little bit concerned that I'd left it off. But I felt it actually, the intro built a lot better, personally, for that kind of forced edit in a way. And then, there's a few little bits and pieces on a couple of Alan's songs, where I know there are issues there, but it's not. I don't think it's glaringly obvious enough not to have gone ahead and done the remix.
Obviously, with recording technology of the age, the way that it was recorded originally, that you only had you were limited by what you could do. Was there anything that you did in '77 that you couldn't change when working on the remix?
There were a few things. I mean, there was some of the double track vocals that we had to bounce down, and to create tracks for other things that I may have preferred that we could have left those separated at the remix, and something like that wouldn't happen. Those decisions wouldn't be made now in the digital world, because it's just you keep going as long as you've got disk space. Whereas we only had 24 tracks, and then I've still got to discuss on a couple of the YouTube videos. I go in that I still have to edit some of the backing vocal process of how we built up. We really multi-layered some of the harmonies, and we did that by using another piece of 2-inch tape in a very archaic process of making a rough mix to 1/4 inch of whatever stage we were at, and then putting up some new 2-inch tape on the machine and transferring that rough mix across, so that we then had 22 tracks, and to actually build up the vocals over like 3-part and 4-part harmonies, like 3 or 4 or 5 tracks at a time. And then we would then mix that down to 1/4 inch again, and then manually fly that 1/4 inch mix back into the original 2-inch tape. I mean, we found a way around it. I mean, but nowadays you wouldn't even think about it. It would be just, new track, create new track, create as many as you want, But so we weren't in a way restricted. We were finding ways around our limitations to expand upon the whole process, And pretty much when I look at others, I still work that way. I don't put everything out on a separate track. I don't put every mic on a separate track like many people do. You have to make decisions, in producing. And at some point, somebody has to make a decision. And I think it's the original production team that should make those decisions, and not send everything off to a remixer where it has to be they have to make the decision. Hey, how should the balance of these toms to the overheads to the hi-hat sound, in this drum section, It's like we made that, because we had a stereo mix, which was the toms and the overhead cymbals. It was all there. Nothing was separated out, apart from there is one tom backbeat on Rockin' All Over the World, which John went in and added, But we made decisions, and it was. I think it was much better for that process. And I still, I'm going into the studio. I'm going into Wally Hyder's old studio in San Francisco in November to work behind a very old Neve, and it will be the same with this band. I will cut everything live, and I'm not saying there's not going to be overdubs. There will be, but I still work to that old way of working. I've done it the other way, where I've made albums one instrument at a time, and I've done albums where everything's been like file shared across and nobody's been in the same room. But I can tell you, there's no thrill like having a band out there and having a few arguments once in a while and just getting to that point where everybody looks at each other and goes, yep, that's it. It's a great feeling, Jamie, to I mean, I love working with bands. I've always worked with bands. My whole career has been. I mean, I've worked with men. I mean, I know I'm known for Quo, but I mean, there's many other bands that I've worked with, like Nazareth and Climax Blues Band. After the Fire, I had a major hit in America. It was #5 here, and you know, a guy called Vinx that I produced with Sting. And I mean, I've always loved that whole area of live recording and spontaneity, and always being ready to hit that record button. You know, I mean, you wouldn't have had an AB Blues, for instance, if I hadn't been all ready to go and saw a little moment of inspiration and like a jam that was going on enough to hit that. And you can even hear it start up. You know, if you listen to that mix, you can hear as I hit this. It was done at Rick's studio, and he had a Studer machine, and it was a little slow on just the uptake, you know, from the take-up spools, and you can hear it slur up, you know, at the front. But I got it, and we got a great track that which was pretty. Apart from some overdubs that we did do at Francis's studio after we'd recorded it at Richard's. You know, which is a great little blues number, you know, that came out of nowhere. It was just we were setting up to do, I think we were doing Carol at that time.
I always wondered how that start came about, and it's because you pushed the button and it fired up. It sounded so kind of deliberate.
I as I'm talking to you, even all these years later, I'm in that room right now. I mean, these are the memories, you know, you carry with you through a lifetime. I'm in that room now, and I can remember discussing it. And we were looking for a B-side for Proposing, you know, and of course the whole politics of publishing all raises their ugly head. And I said, hey, here you go, here's your B-side, a B-side, you know, AB Blues, and here it is, and you can all share the publishing. Everybody can get a credit on this because you all wrote it together in the same room at the same time. You know, it was, and that was how it happened. That was just one of those little moments that happens. You know, and I wish, you know, there'd be more times like that. And I think, and I don't know, but I think that maybe some of the earlier IBC stuff was more conceived like that. Whereas when I'd started from the Rockin' All Over the World period, I mean, everybody was in their own little writing camps. Everybody had their studios. You know, Francis had his 8-track, and Alan had his, and Richard, I think, he had a setup as well. So, you know, of course, John wasn't writing, but they were all starting to write and co-write with other people. And of course, you know, Richard was writing with Jackie Linton as well, and so it was nice when you got something that happened with like came out of a jam, you know. And I wish there'd been more times, and I did try to encourage it, but you know, there was different compartments in writing going on, of everybody more doing their own thing than probably the collective. And I'm sure that Quo's not unique in that. I'm sure there's many bands that start out that way, where everything's very much everybody mucking in together, and then it changes, you know, time changes, success changes, and it takes on a different course.
It's certainly obvious with that album, as we say, with the Rockin' All Over the World album. It does seem a lot more deliberate in kind of bringing lots of different influences together. Now, obviously, when you were working on this remix, which we were talking about, do you have a particular track that you enjoyed working on in particular? Because certainly watching the YouTube videos, there are certain tracks where there's actually you explaining it's a lot longer. There are longer explanations.
You have to understand that there was no production crew to do this video that you're now seeing. And I mean, great credit to my young daughter at the time, who was still in high school, for going along the road here with her dad and holding the camera and getting, you know, some degree of different shots and different angles. But there were times when she wasn't around, and I had the camera just on a lock-off on a tripod just to capture it. And there were times when I was just like, I have to, it's time to move on, because I mean, there's really two sets here to this equation that you're now seeing. I mean, you're seeing me at the point where I've got pretty much the mix assembled in these videos. This is pretty much the final stages of it all coming together. But I've been days to get to that point before I even start to roll the camera. So then there becomes this next stage of actually me talking to a camera, which is not something. I'm a backroom boy. I'm not somebody that's been out there in front in the limelight and been up on stage or been out there doing interviews in any way. I do very few interviews, and so it's a new experience. So I think some of the times I probably was able to talk a little bit more. I was probably more into it, and other times I was like, well, I kind of need to just document this and move on. And because I didn't know what was going to get used, and I mean, I had talked to Bob about it a little bit, when he knew that I was videoing everything, and he said, well, there'll be like a 30-second clip from this and a 15-second clip from that, and to be honest, what you're getting is way beyond really what I ever thought anybody was ever going to see. I never imagined that it would come out in the way that it's coming out to you all now. I thought that it would be at some point, I would get into an editing suite with some director and editor, and it'd all get cut down and cut, and lots of effects used, and some other B-roll material put in. I had wanted to do the process and do over Skype. There are a couple. You've seen one little cameo shot with Bob. I have another one with Bob, but I had wanted to do it with Richard, and I had wanted to do it with Alan and Francis, and I went to Francis with the idea, and he said, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to be involved in it. So it didn't happen. But again, I did want to make it more of a have the band involvement, because I thought that for the fans to want to be interested in seeing this, they wanted to see the band. They didn't necessarily want to see tubby old me behind the camera, rambling on. It was more that they would want to see the band. And so I thought, well, if it's going to stand any chance of getting attention, we've got to bring the band into this. But Francis, I approached, and he said, no, I don't want to do it. So I couldn't push it any more than that. I just kept the camera rolling and talking in the way that I've done from the nine video clips just of the songs, not talking about the whole process of baking the tapes and the transfer process, but I just kept on going with it. I mean, there were times when I thought, well, should I really even be bothered putting the time into doing this? Maybe it's never going to get used, So that's one of the reasons why they don't always get, quite as in depth as what Rockers Rolling was. I mean, yes, to answer your question, finally,
yeah,
I definitely love Rockers Rolling. I loved Who Am I, which you've not seen yet. I love doing Rockin' All Over the World. I love doing Baby. I mean, there's so many I did enjoy doing. I enjoyed doing all of them in different ways, For You was just so, it was just beautiful to hear, Richard again, and his vocals were kept separate. We hadn't mixed those down, and I didn't do anything to those vocal tracks. So I've got a lot of favorites in there, Jamie. I can't just say, it was this one or this one. I mean, you've still got some videos to see when there's a pretty lengthy amount of footage I've got on Rockin' All Over the World, obviously because it's formed the title of the album. So, and some are a little bit shorter, and some I do have more footage, but it's like, when do you stop?
Yeah.
I'm trying to give everybody a little bit of a representation without going completely overboard on it, and just say, hey, this is my gift to you guys. I'm knocking on myself now in years. I don't know, you get to a point where you lose a lot of people around. You think, my daughter really has been the one that's pushed me into doing this. I mean, she said, Dad, you need to get this out there to the fans. She says, I really think you should do a YouTube channel. And I'm like, well, I don't know. What if folks don't like it? You don't want, I don't think any of us like to feel rejection for what we do. I mean, especially when you're putting hours into giving it to people, on a kind of completely open basis like I've done. But my daughter really pushed me along and said, Dad, you should really put this up. So it's up there. I mean, she's a lot to do with it. And I wanted it to be up there. And I think it's probably at that time in my life now. I mean, I've not quite reached 70 yet like Francis, but I'm not too far. I'm not that far behind him. And when you start to see a lot of your mates not be around like they once were, then there's a time where you have to make a decision. Hey, I don't want this to sit in a hard drive and nobody ever see it. So if there is some criticism of it, I'll just take that, and at least there will be probably an overwhelming amount of people that are going to love seeing what I've done, and it will bring pleasure to quite a few people to be able to see these tracks broken down. But there's still a few big ones to come.
I'm sure I speak for many Quo fans when I say that we're very much looking forward to them. I mean, tracks like Baby Boy that you mentioned, there's so many layers going on there that as a listener, certainly in the modern age, listening on mobile phones and things, you can't really appreciate just how much has gone into it. I mean, I didn't realize there was a sitar in there, for example. All these little layers and bits and pieces, and it's wonderful to see them broken down like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's another sitar on the end of Let's Ride as well. That's in the clip I just recently put up there. And then we've still got to do You Don't Own Me and Who Am I and Rockin' All Over the World.
Yeah. Now, obviously, this was released in the deluxe edition of Rockin' All Over the World, as we mentioned earlier. But you were involved in further Quo albums with Pip and alongside the band as well. Do you believe any of those would benefit from the same treatment as what you gave this one?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I really enjoy this at this point of this time. I mean, at this point of my career, I mean, I enjoy it. It's very nice. I love them. I love the nostalgic thing. I love looking back on stuff. It's all part of your life, and I think it's important. Music is such an indelible stamp on that to us all, and so there are things there that I would change. I mean, but some of these are Pip's, Pip's albums, and maybe he should do one next. I don't know. I mean, this might just be a one-off. This catalogue's all owned by Universal Music, so they're the ones really ultimately that could make it happen. I'm unsure what tapes Francis still has. I think that he did have. I did see that the Heat and the Whatever You Want multitracks he had at some point. Whether he's still got them there or not, I don't know. But you could take the same approach on the Heat album. You could strip things back to the bare guitar, drums, bass, and drums again, and take away some of the backing vocals and percussion and horns and stuff. I mean. I'm always open to doing more. I enjoyed the process. I think that Whatever You Want is probably stands up pretty well to this day, and Just Supposing and Never Too Late. I mean, I've done some mastering myself on my own, not released anywhere on those, and I can certainly make some improvements on that. As the co-producer of those albums, if I was to want to change anything of my work with a band on those two albums, it would be probably things like some of the harmony vocals that we did with that were kind of moving more, which were kind of very influenced by ELO, I think, by Jeff Lynne. I mean, Francis is a big fan of Jeff Lynne's, and I think there was a certain attempt to emulate that, but I don't think it really came off that well. So I personally, I would take a lot of those harmonies out. I mean, when you go back, you listen. You can do a mix. I could do a mix today for you, and next week I could do a mix of the same song, and it would be a totally different thing. I've been in a studio with an engineer one day. I worked with this guy, Adam Mosley. I think it was down at 10cc's old studio at Strawberry South. And I was doing Partners in Crime. I was producing John Coughlin's band Partners in Crime. I don't know if you remember that album or not. And I was in there, I was mixing, and I think we'd been all day on a mix, and at the end, and we got all the faders up, and at the end, it was not coming together. And I said, I got hold of the faders, and I pulled everything down. I said, that's it. We're starting again. It's not happening. And so after all those hours, I went back, I pulled everything out, and I started again. And sometimes in mixing, you have to do that. You don't have, just because you've spent X amount of time doesn't mean to say it sounds good. And sometimes by just doing a complete reset and starting again from scratch and pushing the faders up, it'll come together in a couple of hours and you've got it, You've got to just know the point where it's not happening and begin again, And some wonderful, and I think there was years later, Adam, I had a conversation with him, I think he said, oh, I always remember you doing that. He said, I've done it many times since. So that my point is that whenever you're in mixing, it's so subjective, and it can turn out different. It's like baking a cake, you can follow the same recipe, but it's always going to taste different on another time you put it in the oven. And it's the same with mixing music for me. And as I've gone on more into mixing in the latter part of my career, it's a very, very interesting spiritual connection. I don't like anybody else in the room when I'm mixing. I really have got the last few albums, and in fact there was one, I started one band and I said, look, we were on the first day of recording. I said, you have to know that when it comes to mixing, it's just going to be me. I said, I'll submit mixes to you, and you can give me your points of whether you like it or not. But I said, I'm on my own, and I really like that space and that connection that I have to that palette of colors sonically, and I'm usually on my own, and I'm usually, to a few of my very dear friends, I'm usually mixing in my underpants. So there you have a major revelation as to how most of the Rockin' All Over the World remix happened.
Everything you've said there is a great, it's a revelation in itself. It's great theory behind mixing and things. Now we'll start to wrap up here, but I'm on the understanding that you've just mastered some records for Alan. For this live album that's being released by an independent label.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we got Alan started to send me some of his demos, a few years back when I was in Vegas, when I was living in Las Vegas, and I really liked what he was doing, and it was the kind of beginnings of what was being talked about of being PLC, Status Quo PLC. And he had one other project, which was he'd sent me a file of the Bombers, and unfortunately it was all in mono. He sent it to me, but it was a mono track, and I said, like, Al, there's not much I think I can do with this to really enhance it. And anyway, time went by, and then a few months back, he said, John, you talked to me about trying to get this hold of the stereo tape, and and I'd said, look, if you can get hold of the stereo version, make sure you transfer it in at 24-bit 96K, and we'll get the high resolution transfer of the analog And I said, send it over. And so he did that. And then he sent me the track. He said, do you want to have a look at it again? And I said, sure, So I did, and then I started to play around with the mastering of it, and I resequenced it. I resequenced from an order that he had in mind. I chopped a lot of sections out of the recording to kind of really tighten it all up as a performance. So there was a fair bit of editing work that I did, and then I started to process as much as I could to get some width in the stereo and get it to punch. And I took it as far as I could, like production wise, to really trying to elevate it into this age, this time. And it turned out really great. And so I started to send him stuff back, and he absolutely loved it. And he said, well, I don't know exactly what to do with it at that particular time. And then, of course, the Quo convention's coming up in Minehead, so that seemed to be an ideal launching pad for that. So, yeah, I mean, that's nice to be connected. It's nice to be connected with Alan, and talk about the old days, and to do something that's, and also very important is this: John's playing drums on it, and playing drums amazingly well. I mean, he did some fantastic work on this. So it's half of Quo for me. I mean, I'm very pleased with how it's turned out, and I hope it's well received by the fans, and that Alan and John get to talk about it, at the upcoming convention next week, and that the fans get to hear it. And again, it's something. It's not a new recording by any means, but it's been given the best treatment that I can give it to bring it to life. And I so far, all the folks that I've had the feedback from on it absolutely love it. So yeah, so I wish Alan and John and the rest of the Bombers all the very best with it. And it was a lot of fun doing that with Alan,
I and loads of Quo fans really look forward to hearing that, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of majority of them when I say thank you very much for all the work that you do, past and present, because it, like you said about nostalgia, it's nostalgia for a lot of people, and certainly making memories and that sort of thing. So thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Jamie. You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today, and I've enjoyed it immensely.
Yes, thank you for being on the podcast, and maybe at some point in the future you'd like to come on and talk about another aspect, because there were so many questions that I could ask you. It's limitless.
Oh, well, fantastic. Well, I'll be here, be happy to do it, and best wishes with the continue growth of your membership to your podcasts, and hope everything continues to expand for you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Best wishes to all the fans out there, and I wish I could be at Minehead with you all for the convention next week. I hope you have a great time.